Hello, this is Jacob, and this is the history of hurricanes. Today we will be discussing some of the worst hurricanes since 1971, when tracking began for hurricanes, and I will briefly describe each year's weather. Starting in 1971, the first named storm was Arlene. It lasted 4 days and reached 55 miles per hour, reaching a tropical storm status. This was not the only time this name was used. This year for hurricanes was relatively tame. It had 12 named systems with 5 hurricanes. The strongest was Edith with 140 mile per hour winds. 1972 for scale was one of the weaker years for tropical systems, only using 7 names with 3 hurricanes. 1972's strongest storm was Betty with 90 mile per hour winds. 1973 had 8 named storms with 4 hurricanes, the strongest being Ellen at 100 miles per hour. That year had one of the lowest recorded pressures, with Ellen having 962 millibars. It became a tropical storm at noon on September 15th with 46 miles per hour wind, and then became a major hurricane, Category 3, on September 22nd. 1974 had 7 named systems. Carmen takes the title for the worst storm on here, sitting at 130 miles per hour max. On August 30th, it became a tropical storm with 40 mile per hour winds. It reached Category 4 status, but in an interesting turn, after it weakened in early September, it regained strength and intensified. By September 8th, it had regained Category 4 strength. 1975 had 8 named storms, the last being Haley. The worst storm of that year was Gladys on September 24th, 1975. It became a tropical storm and then a hurricane the next day. As a Category 1 storm, it peaked as a Category 4 storm on October 2nd with 132 mile per hour winds. 1976 had 8 named storms, with the worst being Belle, becoming a tropical storm on August 7th with 46 mile per hour winds, and then a Cat 3 the next day. It peaked around 120 miles per hour. 1977 had 6 storms, one of the lowest of the 1970s. However, Hurricane Anita makes up for this and is the worst storm of the year, reaching Category 5 status on September 2nd with 173 miles per hour max. It was forecasted to hit Texas but crossed over Mexico instead. 1978 had 11 named storms, with the strongest being Ella, reaching 120 mile per hour on September 2nd. It affected North Carolina and Newfoundland, Canada. 1979 had 8 named storms, the worst being Hurricane David, a Category 5 which reached 150 miles per hour and affected the East Coast states from Florida to Maine, moving up into Canada. Starting the 80s off, in 1980, there were 11 named storms, and Allen was the worst. It had reached 165 miles per hour and affected southern Texas and made landfall as a Cat 1. It went south of Corpus Christi, Texas. In 1989, there were 11 named storms, with Harvey being the worst. It reached 115 miles per hour and did not affect the United States. In 1982, there were a mere 5 storms. Debbie was the worst, reaching 130 miles per hour. It affected mainly Puerto Rico, causing only 1 fatality. In 1983, there were 4 storms. Alicia was the worst, with 100 mile per hour winds. It affected the greater Houston area and went all the way up to Michigan. It killed 21 people. In 1984, there were 12 storms, with the worst being Major Hurricane Diana. It was the worst storm to have hit the East Coast since Hazel in 1954. The storm had a peak sustained wind of 130 miles per hour, and it had 3 indirect fatalities. In 1985, there were 11 named storms, the worst being Gloria, which formed in the Cape Verde area. It reached Cat 4 status and hit the Outer Banks of North Carolina on September 27th. It also affected the New England area. It killed 14 people. In 1986, there were 6 named storms, with the worst being Earl, having 100 to 105 mile per hour winds. It was pretty tame. The 1986 season did not produce any major hurricanes. In 1987, there were also 6 named storms, with Emily being the worst of them. It peaked as a Cat 3 but weakened to Cat 2 as it passed the Dominican Republic. 3 deaths were reported. In 1988, there were 11 named storms. Looking over the list, one name stood out: Hurricane Gilbert. This storm was devastating and was the worst hurricane to hit Jamaica. It peaked at 160 miles per hour, killing 318 people. But that's not the worst of it. In 1989, there were 11 named storms, the worst storm being Hurricane Hugo, a Category 5 which tore through mid-South Carolina. This storm killed 107 people. The 80s were an interesting time. Fashion, hair metal, all that stuff going on in the 80s. But the 80s has one clear winner for the worst hurricane: Gilbert. It killed nearly 3 times the total death count for each of the rest of the 80s storms. Hurricane Gilbert was the worst of the 80s. Moving on to the 90s. In 1990, there were 14 named storms, the strongest being Gustav, which was the only major hurricane of the season, thankfully. It did not affect the United States and caused minimal damage to the Lesser Antilles. It peaked with 120 mile per hour winds. In 1991, there were a lot of events happening. The fall of the Soviet Union, the Persian Gulf War started, and LA riots due to the killing of Rodney King. But in 1991, the worst hurricane was Claudette. Although it never came into contact with the United States, it hit Category 4. In 1992, there were 6 named storms, the worst being Andrew. It was a Category 5 storm that hit the Bahamas in the southern United States. It had 165 mile per hour winds and caused over $20 billion worth of damage, $61 billion as of this year. It killed 65 people. In 1993, there were 8 named storms, with Emily again being the worst one. It hit Nags Head, North Carolina, and caused 2 deaths. It peaked with 115 mile per hour winds, but was the only hurricane of the year. In 1994, there were 7 named storms, with the worst being Florence. It did not affect anywhere as it stayed in the Atlantic, but was absorbed into another tropical system. It hit Category 2 with 110 mile per hour winds. In 1995, there were 19 named storms, and for the first time on this documentary, there's a tie for the worst hurricane: Opal and Lewis. I picked Opal because of the lower pressure. It hit the Gulf area as a Category 3. It weakened before it hit the peninsula of Florida. The storm name was retired and replaced with Olga in 2001, but it killed more than 60 people. In 1996, there were 13 named storms, the worst being Edward. It hit the New England coast as a tropical storm. It peaked as a Cat 4 with 145 mile per hour winds and caused 2 deaths, but both swimmers in Ocean City, New Jersey. In 1997, there were 7 named storms, with Erica being the worst of them. It peaked at 125 miles per hour and mostly affected the Caribbean. 2 deaths were reported. In 1988, there were 15 named storms. Hurricane George was the worst, having Cat 4 status with 155 mile per hour winds, and had nearly double Hurricane Gilbert's death count at 615. It mostly affected the Caribbean and the southern United States. To wrap up the 90s, we have 1999, another tie between Hurricanes Lenny and Floyd. Floyd had the lowest pressure. Hurricane Floyd was a Category 4 with 155 mile per hour winds. It affected the East Coast in Canada. North Carolina had been ravaged by Dennis, which happened weeks earlier. Floyd killed 85 people. Floyd was then retired and replaced with Franklin. There was one clear winner of the 1990s for worst hurricane, Hurricane George, because it had double what Hurricane Gilbert had for death toll. It's just it was a devastating hurricane. 2000s. In 2000, there were 14 named storms, and yet another tie for the strongest storm between Keith and Isaac. Keith had lower pressure. Keith had 120 mile per hour winds, but peaked as a Category 4. It affected Central America and Mexico, causing $319 million worth of damage. It caused 68 deaths and made landfall an astounding 3 times. 2001 was another year of significance with 9/11 and the War on Terror. And obviously hurricanes, but the worst hurricane was Iris. It affected mostly Mexico, but was a small and powerful Category 4 storm with 145 mile per hour winds. It killed 36 people. 2002 had several named storms, but records say Isidore was the worst storm. It was a Category 3 with 125 mile per hour winds and affected mostly South America and Mexico. It made United States landfall in Louisiana. It killed 22 people. 2003 had 16 named storms, with Isabel being the worst. It had 165 mile per hour winds and made landfall in North Carolina. It mostly affected the Caribbean and southern United States. It killed 51 people. In 2004, there were 15 named storms. Ivan was the strongest. It had 165 mile per hour winds. It made its first landfall in Louisiana and looped across the eastern side of the United States. It left out of the state of Virginia and headed southeast, back down across the Atlantic, back towards Florida. There is a term for it, but I can't think of it now. It's somewhere. And it hung around the Gulf and then made a third landfall in southwestern Texas. It killed 124 people. 2005 had used all the normal names on their list, but one storm had to take the cake. Katrina. It hit the southern United States. It was a Category 5. It killed 1,392 people, which is like double, almost a little bit more than double what George killed. It had a max sustained wind of 175 miles per hour. 80% of New Orleans was flooded. So in 2006, in April of 2006, Katrina was retired. 2006 had a tie for the worst storms, Gordon and Helene. Both storms attained a Category 3 status. Gordon caused no fatalities, neither did Helene. Both storms had 120 mile per hour winds. This year would produce 9 named storms. In 2007, there were 15 named storms, the worst being Hurricane Dean, which impacted the Lesser and Greater Antilles, Central America, the U.S. Gulf Coast and southwestern United States. This storm took 45 lives. In 2008, there were 16 named storms, with the worst being Hurricane Ike, which hit the Galveston area at 2:10 in the morning Central Time. It also took a similar path to the 1900 Galveston hurricane, which is recorded to be the worst hurricane to have hit the United States. It had winds at 145 mile per hour, killing 214 people and causing $38 billion worth of damage. In 2009, there were 9 named storms. The strongest storm was Hurricane Bill, which caused minor damage to the East Coast in Atlantic Canada, peaking at 130 miles per hour as a Cat 4 storm. It caused 2 deaths. 32,000 people were without power. For the 2000s, the worst hurricane has to be Katrina. In terms of total damage, Katrina, it just took everything else. It flooded New Orleans, and they actually sued the army for it because the army had built the levees in New Orleans. So after Katrina, the city sued the army, which they were found not liable for, which is kind of tragic considering how many lives were lost in 2005. For 2010, started off with 19 named storms. The worst was Hurricane Igor, which hit 135 miles per hour as a Cat 4. It affected the Caribbean and northeastern United States, killing 4. However, it caused less than $500,000 worth of damage. In 2011, there were 18 named hurricanes, the worst being Ophelia. It reached Category 4 status but caused minimal damage and no fatalities, mostly affecting the Leeward Islands, Bermuda, and Newfoundland. 2011 also had the super outbreak of tornadoes with the Joplin tornado and all that. So 2011 was not a good year for meteorology with just how bad everything was. In 2012, there were 19 named storms. The worst was Hurricane Sandy, also known as Superstorm Sandy unofficially, obviously. It was a Category 3 storm. It hit the Bahamas, most of the eastern United States, Bermuda, and Canada. It killed 254 people and caused $68.7 billion worth of damage, making landfall in New Jersey and flooding New York. In 2013, there were 14 named storms. It was a weak Category 1 Humberto, which was considered the worst. It did not affect the United States. It stayed over the northern Atlantic, and I assume once it got to the dead zone, a place up by Canada and like the Arctic region, it dissipated or joined some other tropical system to, do that. 2014 there were 8 named storms. The worst was Hurricane Marie, a Category 5 with 160 mile per hour winds. It stayed mostly over land, but its wind field was big enough to hit Los Angeles and other parts of California. It caused 6 deaths and had a barometric pressure of 918 millibars. It caused $20 million worth of damage. In 2015, there were 11 named storms. The worst was Hurricane Joaquin, which reached Category 4 with 155 mile per hour winds. Just 5 miles per hour shy of a Category 5, which is 160 mile per hours and above for Cat 5. It affected the Bahamas, Haiti, Cuba, the southern United States, and Bermuda. Killed 34 people and caused $200 million worth of damage. In 2016 was mostly good vibes. We had a new president elected and 15 named hurricanes. The worst was Hurricane Matthew, a Category 5 that devastated the southern U.S., the Windward and Leeward Islands, Colombia, Venezuela, and the Greater Antilles, which caused $731 deaths and $16.5 billion worth of damage. This storm reached 165 mile per hour winds. In 2017, there were 17 named storms. The worst by winds was Hurricane Irma, a Category 5 with an intense 180 mile per hour winds, which affected the Bahamas, Florida, Turks and Caicos, and Jamaica, causing 134 deaths and $77 billion worth of damage. In 2018, there were 19 named storms. The worst was Hurricane Michael. It had 160 mile per hour winds. It was the first Category 5 to hit Florida since Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Entering through the panhandle of Florida before moving across the south and exiting through Virginia. It killed 74 people and $25 billion worth of damage. In 2019, there were 18 named storms. The worst was Hurricane Dorian. It had 185 mile per hour winds. It affected the Bahamas and southern United States, killing 84 people. 245 people were missing and caused about $5 billion worth of damage. The worst storm of the 2010s was Hurricane Matthew. 2020, it was a ride of a year. Pandemics, riots, all that. There were 30 named systems. 30. That is more names than in the alphabet. They had to use the Greek alphabet to name the hurricanes. The worst was Hurricane Iota, a Category 4 with 155 mile per hour winds. It affected the Central Americas, killing 84 people and had 41 people missing. It caused $1.4 billion worth of damage. 2021 election, all that stuff happened, and hurricanes. The worst was Hurricane Ida, which was a Category 4 with 150 miles per hour wind. It affected the northern and South America area and the east coast of the United States. It killed 112 people, which caused $75 billion worth of damage. 2022 had 14 named storms, the worst being Hurricane Ian, a devastating Category 5 with 160 mile per hour winds. This storm affected Trinidad and Tobago, Venezuela, Colombia, Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, Cuba, and the southeastern United States. It killed 161 people and costed $113 billion worth of damage. In 2023, there were 20 named storms. The worst was Hurricane Lee, with 165 mile per hour winds. It killed 4 people. It affected Bermuda, the northeastern United States, and eastern Canada. It caused $80 million worth of damage. 2024 has been a chaotic year. Politics, weather. 2024, it's really been chaotic. We've almost used up all the hurricane names. The most recent was former Hurricane Oscar. This year is not over yet, so it would be difficult to give you an accurate look at what the most strong storm would be for the year. But I believe either Hurricane Helene or Milton will take it, but we will see as the time progresses. That was the worst hurricanes of every year since 1971. And now, let's move on to some other weird but interesting stuff about hurricanes. From 1971 to now, 96 storm names have been retired. 96 names. Man, you gotta think. And they use the rotation of the names every like 4 or 6 years, I think. They rotate it between 4 and 6 years, giving new names to hurricanes that were too chaotic and got retired out of fear of being insensitive to the victims. And it would be kind of inappropriate to rename a hurricane after another major hurricane had that exact same name. For the worst storms of across all these decades that we discussed, these were the names of your final contestants. 1980, Hurricane Gilbert, 318 deaths, peaked at 160. 1990s, Georges, which had 615 deaths and 155 mile per hour winds. 2000s was Katrina with 1,300 deaths and 175 mile per hour winds. 2010s, Matthew with 731 deaths and 165 mile per hour winds. We cannot quite determine the 2020 decade just yet because we're still 6 years out from 2030. So, out of all of these hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina I would consider the worst hurricane on this list. It had 1,392 deaths. So, and it took the lead for strongest hurricane with 175 mile per hour winds. For this next segment, we will be discussing hurricanes, how they're formed, and their categories. A hurricane is defined as a tropical system over 75 mile per hour. Anything below that, 39 to 74 mile per hour, would be considered a tropical storm. Anything under 35 would be a tropical depression. Category 1 is anything from 75 mile per hour to 95 mile per hour winds. Category 2 is 96 to 110 mile per hour. Cat 3, 110 to 129 miles per hour. Category 4 is 130 to 156. And the worst, Category 5, anything above 157 miles per hour. I know earlier I said it was 160, but that's what it was defined by NOAA as the Cat 5, which, by the way, is the North Atlantic Ocean. Okay. Hurricanes they usually start where warm water is. They need it to survive. And then when, activity happens, it's a tropical wave or invest at sometimes. They only use 94 to 99 before resetting. These storms need at least 26.2 degrees Celsius waters to form. Otherwise, it's too cold, they won't develop. Thunderstorms also aid in development, and with very little wind shear will tear apart hurricanes, along with mountains, which is usually why storms weaken as they cross over the Caribbean, especially over Puerto Rico, because it's very mountainous, which tears apart hurricanes, thankfully. Hurricanes can get stronger over warm waters if it's gained at least 35 miles per hour within 24 hours. So 35 miles per hour in 24 hours. It's considered to have gone under rapid intensification. But if it goes from category 1 to category 5 within 24 hours, it's called explosive intensification because it's explosive how fast it grew in strength. Another cool thing I learned was about hurricanes merging. with one another called the Fujiwara effect. It's when two hurricanes come close together. It looks like they're doing a dance around each other, so they'll either merge with each other or shoot off into their own path. The weird and awesome, the slowest moving hurricane ever was Hurricane Sally, which moved at 2 miles per hour. September is the most active month for hurricane development. Usually waters are warm, and this next segment is about trying to defeat hurricanes. It's happened in the movies with Twisters, that new movie where they try to defeat a tornado. But could this actually translate over to hurricanes? Well, let's find out. As dumb as it sounds, there are meetings that address this question. Is it possible to defeat a hurricane? The first suggestion was nuking a hurricane, which, in theory, I guess, because explosive would make things, it would explode the hurricane, maybe. I don't know really the logic behind it. But this is not a good idea for several reasons. First, we don't have the energy capacity to do it. Our strongest bomb was like Sarzamba, which was like, I think, 50 megatons of TNT. But no, we do not have a hurricane, any power to do that. There's nothing strong enough to do that. I can't, it's just that, man. Not to mention the fallout of the hurricane, which would make it a radioactive hurricane. It's an interesting theory, but no, I would not recommend it. I rate it a 1 out of 10. The second suggestion does kind of make sense. Cool the ocean with ice. Hurricanes can't form if the water's cold, which does have some logic to it, yes. But this is not likely to happen because of how unpredictable the track of your hurricane could be. And not to mention, that's a lot of ice that would be needed. Possible, but probably not going to happen. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Third, we could replicate Saharan dust, which tears apart hurricanes because the Sahara is very dry. Hurricanes need moisture to survive, which in theory could make sense because if you're putting it into it, it should hypothetically weaken the hurricane, right? It's possible, but probably not. Evaporation would take place, and all you'd really get is muddy rain, and I don't think anybody really wants to deal with that. 5 out of 10, possible, but not likely. Fourth, wind turbines. Florida people, you guys have already tried this with Hurricane Irma. On Facebook, there was a group of people pledging to point fans and wind turbines at the hurricane to push it away. Some crazy people also suggested trying to shoot the hurricane. Do not do that. Please do not do that. That is going to make things worse if you're trying to shoot a hurricane. First of all, it won't feel it. It's not going to cause pain. Second of all, you're going to make the bullet go flying all over the place, whirl around, and hit somebody. So it's probably more deadly than a real hurricane. With that being said, I give this my number one suggestion, but no, I would not recommend doing it. This one was my favorite one to talk about, but we don't have enough power to make this happen. Nothing is strong enough to do that except God, obviously. But I don't think religion is going to play a part in this, which actually they really could have brought up. But 6.1 out of 10. Funny, but please don't. For the love of God, please don't. Finally, we have cloud seeding. This was a U.S. government idea with Project Storm Fury. It happened through the 60s and 80s. But no, there's not enough super cooled water in hurricanes. 4 out of 10. Not gonna happen. Nope. Also, with global warming, will make the waters warmer, so that's also a big nope. We just have to accept that hurricanes are a part of life. Global warming is the leading cause of most of this development, but as the years go on, we will likely get stronger and bigger hurricanes. Unfortunately, all you can do is just take the advice given to you by the Red Cross and evacuate if you're told to. Moving on to the next segment. Here I have some questions that I personally had about hurricanes. Question number 1. Category 6? Possible? In hypotheticals, there has been category 6. But this would have to have wind speeds to exceed 192 miles per hour. Some storms have done such a thing. Typhoon Haiyan and Patricia, with 195 and 215 miles per hour wind, respectively. So while no short term, maybe in the future, we'll see some Category 6 hurricanes. But as far as I see it right now, probably not gonna happen. What was the longest lasting hurricane? Cyclone Freddy lasted 34 days. It affected mostly Africa and the Malaysian area. It killed 1,400 people and had 230-mile-per-hour winds. This storm lasted 5 weeks between August and September. What is the most common letter for a hurricane to get retired with? The letter I has 13 named storms to have retired. And I'm sure this will update very soon as we get more hurricanes coming and all that. This one was a big question I used to ask myself a lot when I was a kid. Is it possible for a hurricane to form over land? I know it sounds stupid and completely contradictory to what I said earlier, where they need warm water and all that to form. But actually, not solidly, but 2% of hurricanes between 1851 and 2015 have formed over land. These storms who beat the odds were named Julia in 2000, Leslie, 1988, Beryl, 1977, Clara, 1978, Amelia. The least retired letter is the letter B, which has not had a name retired since Bob back in 1991. Over 20 or 30 years since the letter B has had a hurricane to have retired it. However, this could update. It could happen. Anyways, to wrap things up, this hurricane season will end on November 30th, when the waters are cooler and little, if any, hurricane development can happen. This is what you can do to prepare. Know where you're going. Have a plan. Do not leave at the last minute, because by then, it's too late. At this point, you're better off hunkering down in your house. Stay away from windows and get low into like an interior basement. Stay away from glass. Please. Adapt. You're probably not going to have power for a while. So get some batteries so you can get some supplies. That non-perishable foods are really great. Move to higher ground. I feel like this is kind of logical because if the storm surge is going to be like 10 to 12 feet, there's no person on earth that's 10 to 12 feet tall. The tallest person was 8'11", Robert Wadlow Pershing. But he lived way back in like the 1920s or 30s, I believe. And not even he would be able to stand. That water would still, at minimum, be like 2 feet above him. Secure loose items that can cause damage to your house. Cut down dead tree limbs. Actually, trim tree limbs as much as you can because, you know, a big tree is probably going to end up falling on your house if the hurricane's really, really bad. Follow the CAMS rule. You should be safe. But more information, if you need it, is on the Red Cross website. When in doubt, throw it out. If you suspect something is rotten, throw it out. Be safe. Don't risk it. I know the expiration date would say, "Oh, this is good till March." But if a hurricane happens, throw it out because you're not going to be able to cool down that food because, your refrigerator, unless you have a generator, will probably be down. Unless you live in like a high priority area where you'll pretty much get immediate help. Turn around. Don't drown. You don't know how deep or what is in that water that could be in there. Tree limbs, broken glass, heck, dead bodies. Anything in that water could cause damage to you or a loved one. And if you're trying to survive, I don't think that's what you want. Before you go, if you enjoyed this documentary, check it out, man. I mean, I'll post it to YouTube at some point. Remember to be kind to one another because you never know the struggle the other person could be facing. This has been Jacob Mergel from Palmetto High School, and this was the History of Hurricanes. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.